Welcome to the Mindset Game podcast. I'm Verit Kogan, and I'm very delighted to introduce our very special guest, Nir Eyal. Nir is a keynote speaker, consultant, and best-selling author, specializing in the intersection of psychology, technology, and business. He is a former lecturer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and at the Hasso Plattner Institute of Design, otherwise known as D-School. His national best-selling books are Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products, and Indistractable, How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life, which, by the way, was named one of the best business and leadership books of the year, according to Amazon, and one of the best personal development books of the year by Audible, which is amazing. Nir is a sought-after keynote speaker on consumer psychology, habits, personal productivity, and dealing with distraction in and out of the workplace, which is what our focus will be on today in our conversation. And in addition to blogging at nirandfar.com, so that's NIR and far.com, his writing has been featured in the New York Times, the Harvard Business Review, Time Magazine, and Psychology Today. And Nir, that's a pretty incredible bio. And there were many other things that I didn't include that I could have included, but we'd be sitting here all day. Certainly very accomplished and really a delightful person. We had a little bit of a conversation before we started to record, and just really grateful you're here with us today and excited to hear you share about these topics that are on the minds of many people these days, and certainly leaders these days.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So how about we start with, what do you mean by indistractable?
Yeah. So I made up the word so I can define it any way I want. So to be indistractable means that you're the kind of person who strives to do what they say they're going to do. Okay, strives to do what they say they're going to do. And so the difference between a distractible person and an indistractable person, it's not that the indistractable person never gets distracted. That's impossible. I still get distracted from time to time. The difference is that an indistractable person knows why they got distracted, and they take steps today to prevent getting distracted tomorrow. Paulo Coelho had a wonderful quote. He said, "A mistake repeated more than once is a decision." I'll say it again. It's so good. A mistake repeated more than once is a decision. So how many of us keep getting distracted again and again by email or WhatsApp or Slack channels or whatever, the news, and we keep going off track. We keep getting taken away from what we say we're going to do with our time and attention. We are deciding to be distractible. And that was me. I wrote this book for me more than anyone else out there. And so in the path of learning how to become indistractable, when I finally became the kind of person who could say, okay, I see what you did there to me the first time, distraction. Okay, that's fine. But now I'm going to make sure that that doesn't happen again and again. And since then, there is no aspect of my life, my physical health, my mental health, my business, my family relationships, everything has gotten better since I became indistractable, which is something that I've learned anyone can become.
Super cool. So let's jump right into it. How did you do it?
How do you do it? Yeah. So let's start with first, what is distraction? And I think really being indistractable is the skill of the century, that if you can't focus your attention, if you can't decide how you spend your time, none of those other skills will matter, right? Today we have this gift of having the world's information at our fingertips. If you don't know how to do something, it's all there. Just Google it. The problem is we don't know how to stop getting in our own way. We don't know how to stop getting distracted. Most people know basically what to do. If you want to get in shape, for the vast majority of people, you eat right and you exercise. We know that. If you want to do better at your job, you have to do the hard work that other people don't want to do. We know that. If you want to have better relationships with your family and loved ones, you have to be fully present. Again, we know all this. What we don't know is how to actually follow through, how to stop getting distracted. And so that's really what I want to help people do, is not to tell them what they have to do with their lives, but how to help people do the things that they themselves want to do, but for lack of the ability to follow through, they don't do. And so what my mission is to help people live without regret, to live your life in a way that you can look back on and say, yep, that's what I want to do with my time and attention because I am indistractable. So how do we do it? Let's start with, what is distraction? Okay. If you ask people what is the opposite of distraction, most people will tell you it's focus, right? I don't want to be distracted. I want to be focused. But that is not actually accurate. That if you look at the etymology of the word, the opposite of distraction is not focus. The opposite of distraction is traction. We have traction and distraction, right? They're opposites, obviously. If you look also that both words come from the same Latin root, trahare, which means to pull. And both words also end in the same 6 letters, A-C-T-I-O-N, that spells action, reminding us that distraction is not something that happens to us, but rather it is an action we ourselves take. So traction, by definition, is any action that pulls you towards what you said you were going to do. Things that move you closer to your values and help you become the kind of person you want to become. Those are acts of traction. The opposite of traction, distraction, is any action that pulls you further away from what you said you were going to do, further away from your values, further away from becoming the kind of person you want to become. So this is really important. This isn't just semantics, because I would argue the difference between traction and distraction is one word. And that one word is intent. As Dorothy Parker said, the time you plan to waste is not wasted time. So what I see a lot of people doing these days is vilifying and moralizing these perfectly fine behaviors that somehow we get into a moral panic around, like, technology's at fault. It's social media. It's my iPhone. It's, these tech companies doing it to me. And that is not true. It's not true. There's nothing wrong with watching YouTube videos. There's nothing wrong with playing a video game, as long as you do it on your schedule and according to your values. Now it's an act of traction if it's done with intent in advance. Conversely, distraction, it turns out, most people don't recognize what it's happening. So for those, for all of us who are listening who are professionals, see if this sounds familiar, right? I would sit down at my desk for years and I would say, okay, now I'm going to work on that big important project. Nothing's going to get in my way. Here I go. I'm not going to get distracted. Let me work on that big project that I've been putting off. Here I go. I'm going to get started right now. But first, let me check some email, right? Let me scroll through that Slack channel real quick. Let me just do a few items on my to-do list, some of the easy stuff, just to get some momentum going. These are all work-related tasks, right? And what I didn't realize is that that is the most dangerous, most pernicious form of distraction, because you don't even realize you're getting distracted. So just because it's a work-related task, I see this all the time, right? People put off the important and hard work that they have to do to move their lives and careers forward. And all they're doing all day is the urgent and easy stuff. And that's death, right? That is horrible. That is the recipe for living a life full of regret. But you don't even realize you're getting distracted because we pawn it off as saying, well, it's work related. I got to check email at some point today. I'm being productive, right? Wrong. If it's not what you said you were going to do in advance, it's just as bad of a distraction, maybe even worse than playing video games or scrolling social media, because you don't even realize you're distracted. So now that we have this dichotomy between traction and distraction, we can look at the triggers. There are 2 kinds of triggers. Most people, when they think about distraction, they think about external triggers, the pings, the dings, the rings, all these things in our outside environment that can lead us towards distraction. But would you believe that studies find that only 10% of the time we get distracted, 10%, is it because of an external trigger? 10%. So it's important, but it's not the majority, not even close, of the times we get distracted. Turns out 90% of the time we get distracted not because of an external trigger, but because of what we call an internal trigger. What I learned in my 10 years of research is that the vast majority of distraction begins from within. Because distraction, by and large, is an emotion regulation problem. It's about escaping boredom, loneliness, fatigue, uncertainty, anxiety, stress. That is the cause of 90% of our distractions. So if we keep blaming this stuff outside of ourselves, which we can't change, right? We can't hop into some magical time machine before technology, right? That doesn't exist. And in fact, we know 2,500 years before the internet, Plato, the Greek philosopher, was talking about how terrible the world was in terms of distraction. He called it akrasia, the tendency to do things against our better interest. So people have been complaining about distraction for at least the past 2,500 years. It can't be technology's fault, folks. There's a much deeper, much more interesting, and much more empowering way to conquer distraction. It's not as simple as getting rid of your smartphone. That's not going to cut it. What we have to do, to answer your question, is follow these 4 strategies. Number 1, master the internal triggers, those uncomfortable emotional states, or they will become your master. That's step number 1. Step number 2, we make time for traction. Step number 3, we hack back the external triggers. And step number 4, we prevent distraction with pacts. So everybody wants the quick wins. They want the tactics. They want the gimmicks. That stuff's nice, but that stuff comes and goes. Tactics are what you do. Strategies are why you do it. So if I can leave people with, listening today, whether you read the book or not, these 4 definitive strategies that I've been researching for the past 10 years, right? That I've led, and you can, in the back of my book, there's 30 pages of citations to peer-reviewed studies. These are the 4 fundamental strategies that anyone can use to become indistractable.
Thank you. And I appreciate that you kind of shared with us that dichotomy, right? Distraction and traction. And the fact that the internal triggers are really the more dominant aspect of the triggers that are causing the distraction. So tell us a little bit more about that, about the internal triggers.
Yeah. So maybe we'll back up a second to from this this question of why do we get distracted, which I think is a fascinating question, right? There's a reason that Plato was asking this question 2,500 years ago. Why is it that despite knowing what to do, we don't do it? And that's still the same problem that people have been struggling with for at least the past 2,500 years. So to answer that question, I think we need to go a layer deeper. And we have to ask the question, why do we do anything and everything? What is the nature of human motivation? And the nature of human motivation, most people think it's about carrots and sticks, right? We've all heard this metaphor that, it's about the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Jeremy Bentham said something like this. Sigmund Freud said something like this. Turns out we now know, neurologically speaking, when we actually look inside the brain to see what's happening, neurologically speaking, that is not true. It's a myth that there is no carrot and stick. It doesn't exist. In fact, did you see The Matrix? Did you see that movie?
Of course, yes.
You know that scene in The Matrix where Neo walks into the room and there's that child with the spoon, and the spoon starts bending, and the child says he wants Neo to realize that there is no spoon. And so I'm going to give you that same moment right now. That here's the thing: the carrot is the stick. The carrot is the stick, because neurologically we now know that the brain drives us not in the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain, but in fact, everything you do is about a desire to escape discomfort. The carrot is the stick, even the pursuit of pleasurable sensations. The brain doesn't get us to do what feels good. The brain gets us to do what felt good, the memory of what provided some kind of pleasure. And so the brain uses what? Discomfort, wanting, longing, desire. We say love hurts. It does, because that's the way the brain gets us to act. So even pleasurable sensations are themselves psychologically destabilizing. The carrot is the stick. So once you realize that all human behavior is spurred by the desire to escape discomfort, that must therefore mean that time management is pain management. Money management is pain management. Weight management is pain management, because everything is about the dealing with discomfort. So some people hear that and it sounds kind of pessimistic, right? What does that mean? We're not about, we don't like pleasure. No. What it means is essentially that everything that we don't do when it comes to our stated preferences, any reason we don't carry out those preferences, right? Everybody wants to get in shape. Everybody wants to have a successful business. Everybody wants to have great relationships. If there's something that's blocking you from doing that, there's only one reason. The reason is fundamentally one of these internal triggers. It's our inability to deal with discomfort in a healthy way that leads us towards traction rather than trying to escape it with distraction. So when I did the research for this book, what I found was when I interviewed high performers in every field, the arts, athletics, business, what you will see is that people at the top of their game in these professions, they still have these same internal triggers, just like the rest of us. They feel bored, they feel lonely, they feel stressed, they feel anxious. The difference is that these high performers have learned tactics to take that discomfort and use it as rocket fuel to propel them towards traction, whereas low performers, they escape it. Whenever they feel discomfort, they drink, they watch TV, they scroll the news, they do something to escape the discomfort, whereas high performers, indistractable people, know how to deal with that discomfort in a helpful rather than harmful manner. So what I do in the book is I give people over a dozen different tactics that they can use starting from day one. They're on every single page of that first section. These tactics that you can use, these arrows in your quiver, that when you feel that discomfort, you know what to do with that discomfort. You have a tactic in place to lead you towards traction rather than what I used to do, which is, and most people who are distractible do, is continuously trying to escape that discomfort with distraction.
Yeah, and I love that you offer those resources, because I think that the ability to choose, right, in that moment, first to notice that there's some inner trigger, right? We got to first become conscious of what's happening, yes? and to be able to use these tools to essentially go inward, right? To be able to kind of notice what's happening, and as you said, to leverage that energy in some other way. And there are also some wonderful learnings that come with pausing and accepting emotions. And we've had, other guests on the show that talk about the language of emotions and the gifts of emotions and building resilience and those kinds of things, because there's a reason why it is happening. Yes, it is showing up. And when it's a pattern, it's a good opportunity to look inward and say, okay, what do I need to learn here so that, these triggers are not quite as constant or as intense. And it's just easier. So tell us a little bit more about kind of the making time for traction, that second step.
Sure. So the first step is the most important, and that's the one that most people tend to skip, around master these internal triggers or they will become your master. And it doesn't require a lot of work. You don't need to go see a psychiatrist. Nothing wrong with that, but it's not necessary for the vast majority of people. You just need a toolkit in place. And so I give people very, very practical tools. We can talk about some of those if you'd like, around how do we master those internal triggers so they don't become our masters. The second, but that's not enough. Okay. That's the step that most people skip over because they want the tips and tricks, but it's absolutely critical. None of the other techniques will work unless you realize why you're getting distracted in the first place. And so 90% of those distractions, again, begin from within. So that's step one. Step two is making time for traction, meaning that you cannot call something a distraction unless you know what it distracted you from. I'll say it again. You can't call something a distraction unless you know what it's distracting you from. So if you have a calendar with lots of white space, what the heck did you get distracted from? You didn't plan your time. Everything's a distraction. And so this is a cold, hard truth that many people don't like to hear. I certainly didn't like to hear this, that if you don't plan your day, somebody's going to plan it for you. Whether it's the news, whether it's your boss, whether it's your kids, whether it's Facebook, whatever, something. There are too many vested interests out there that will take your time unless you decide in advance how you will spend it. Now, how do you decide how you will spend your time? You decide in advance based on your values. What are values? I define values as the attributes of the person you want to become. And if you want to know what someone's values really are, you look at two things. You look at how they spend their money and how they spend their time. And most people get it completely backwards. Most people are super stingy with their money, right? They clip coupons. They debate whether they're going to buy a 99-cent app. Is that too expensive? They split checks when they go out to lunch with their friends. They're super cheap with their money, but their time, they just give it away, right? Whoever wants it, sure, take it. Whatever you want with my time, okay, fine. I'll help you with that. Here, let me give you my time to traditional media. Let me give my time to whatever little request is out there. And it should be exactly backwards. We should be stingy with our time and generous with our money. Why? Because you can always make more money. You can always make more money, but you cannot make more time. I don't care if you're Elon Musk or Bill Gates. You only have the same 24 hours in a day. Right? Everybody only has 24 hours in a day, but you can always make more money. So what we need to do is to decide in advance how you will spend your time based on those values. A lot of people follow this to-do list technique, which I used to follow. And I've seen actually how it's a very destructive technique, how using these little check boxes, which is kind of the traditional productivity advice that we've all heard a million times, is actively harmful for many, many reasons. One of them being that there's no feedback loop with to-do lists. Now, there's nothing wrong about getting things out of your brain and putting them on a piece of paper, but most people stop there, right? And they wake up in the morning and say, what am I supposed to do with my day? Okay, let me look at my to-do list. My to-do list will tell me what to do. And then what do? They do the easy stuff, right? They do the urgent stuff. They don't do the stuff that really matters. They don't do the hard and important work that moves their careers forward. So the biggest problem with to-do lists is that there's no feedback mechanism with to-do lists. Right? You don't learn how long things take. And we know that on average, it's called the planning fallacy, that on average, people take 3 times longer to finish a task than they predict. Because if you think about it, when you use the traditional to-do list method, you look at a task, you start working on it for 5 minutes. Okay, let me do that for a few minutes. And then, oh, there's that email I've been needing to respond to. And oh, there's that Slack channel request. And oh, my boss might need something. And so the people who are devoted to these to-do lists, they don't know how long a task will take. Whereas people who use what's called setting an implementation intention, time boxing is what we call it. And this is I didn't make up this technique. This has been around for decades. There are thousands of peer-reviewed studies that show how effective this technique is. And it's simply a matter of planning out what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. Now, when you tell yourself, hey, I have a 30-minute block of time to work on a task, the goal is not to finish. The goal is not to finish. Okay, you can finish the task, that's fine, but that should no longer be your goal. And this is something that's really hard for people to understand because they're so used to checking off these cute little boxes. That's not the goal. The goal is one thing, to work on that task or do that thing for as long as you said you would without distraction. That's it. Work on that task for as long as you said you would without distraction. It does not matter if you finish. Because now, if you do that, if you say, hey, I'm going to work on that task for 15 minutes or 30 minutes, doesn't matter how long, now you have a metric for how far you got in that period of time. Okay, I said I need to finish this presentation, and it's a 30-slide presentation, and I did about 3 slides. That means I need a 10 more blocks of time that big to finish the entire task. You cannot do that with any other time management technique. Mm-hmm. It's incredibly important. Another thing that's so terrible about to-do lists and why time boxing is so much better is that to-do lists have no constraints. There's no constraint. You can always add more things to a to-do list. So what happens? You get home from work at the end of the day, and you look at the million things you still have not finished. And this is now this register of your deficiencies, right? You've been working all day, and yet here's a million things you said you were going to do, you didn't do. Loser. And that begins to take a psychic toll on people. And that's when you hear people saying these ridiculous things like, oh, I'm no good at time management. Maybe I have undiagnosed ADHD. There must be something wrong with me. No, there's nothing wrong with you. It's a stupid time management technique that's broken. So that's why making time for traction is so much better than any other productivity technique that I've ever seen. And people think it takes a lot of time. It doesn't. What you do, you start with your values, and we can walk through, if that's interesting, exactly how to do that. There's 3 life domains that you have to ask yourself about. You plan that time for your week. Most people, about 80% of the people I work with, they can do it for an entire week. Some people have to do it on a daily basis, but the vast majority of people do it on a weekly basis. It takes 10 minutes a week. After you get in this practice, literally 10 minutes a week, it's a life-changing practice. And so that's all about making time for traction by turning your values into time.
Brilliant. And I appreciate the focus on the intention, right? As we said from the very beginning, right? And the mind shift around what is the measure of success, right? Because, when we take the illusion away of, I'm going to sit down and be able to complete this whole task or everything on the list, we're
doesn't work that way.
Exactly. It's kind of like setting ourselves up for failure. So
and by the way, just to add, sorry to interrupt. So I want you also to schedule time for the fun things, for the enjoyable things. There's nothing that says that your calendar has to be full of work-related tasks. Quite the opposite. Part of the problem with other productivity techniques out there is that they don't plan time for the things that make life worth living, right? Time with your family, time to pray, time to meditate, time to paint, time to walk, time to do whatever it is you want to do with your life. It turns out, by planning that time as well, you can actually experience what real leisure feels like. This is what I call the tyranny of the to-do list. The tyranny of the to-do list happens even when you get home from work and you just want to relax, you just want to be with your family, you just want to watch Netflix, you just want to read a book and take it easy. The problem with these to-do lists is that you have in the back of your mind all the things you didn't finish. And so even when you're with your family, you're thinking about work. Whereas when you become indistractable, that time on your schedule becomes traction. So if it's, hey, I want to watch Netflix, I want to go on social media, I want to be with my family, I want to do nothing, you can put that in your schedule and not feel guilt about it. Because what you're doing is essentially
nothing.
Exactly. That's totally fine. But by planning that time in advance, by saying, this is what I should be doing with my time, now that becomes traction. So you can actually take former distractions. Like, people think, oh, if I watch YouTube videos or if I'm playing around on the internet, that's a distraction. Well, by planning time for it, now it became traction rather than distraction.
So what if the distractions are things that are aligned with your values? So let's say I value family. And, I'll give you an example. So I value family. And today I wanted to read some more of your book. And, one of my daughters needed help with something. And then another daughter needed help with something. And they were both semi-urgent things that needed to be done today. And so some of the book reading time went to that. So in examples like that, where it's either that, or let's say it's a boss or a coworker or a client that really requires something to get done right away. What do you do about that?
Absolutely. So, and I've heard in the past 10 years, I've heard every possible excuse. and I used to come up with every possible excuse. So the only time you should interrupt your pre-planned calendar is when it's a crisis. Okay. An actual crisis. A crisis is an urgent event that could not have been predicted. So kids have homework and they need help, right? Kids get sick and they need to be picked up from school. Lots of things happen, but there's urgent client requests. There are fire drills. Those are predictable, right? Lightning hitting your house, not predictable. Okay, that happens. That's a 1 in a million. Okay, you're allowed to change your calendar. But when we, in advance, say, look, I know that my kids will need help. I'm a father of a teenager. I have time in my schedule for my daughter, right? And if it's an absolute, oh my God, somebody's bleeding. Yeah, couldn't predict if somebody's actually in physical danger. That's when she's going to need my help. But short of that, when I take time to say in advance, here's what my schedule looks like, and here's my time for my daughter. And we do what's called a schedule sync. I talk about this practice in the book. I do a schedule sync with my wife. I do a schedule sync with my daughter. People should be schedule syncing with their colleagues and coworkers as well. It's a very simple practice. It takes maybe 5 minutes a week. And when you get that clarity of, hey, I have that time ready for you at this time. Does that still work for you? Great. Now we're synchronized. Now they know on a regular basis, this is the time when mom's available or dad's available. And if it's truly a crisis, wow, we could not have predicted it, of course, but that should be, maybe 1% occurrence, as opposed to what happens to most people is because they are worried about the potential of being needed, they failed to plan in the first place. Right. And as we've all heard a million times, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So don't make that mistake. Put the time in your schedule to read my book and to be with your kids in advance, right? According to the constraint of how much time you have in your day, because that is the only way that you can live without regret, because you have to make trade-offs. You have to make trade-offs. You can't write your book and read and exercise and meditate and be a mom and do all the things you want to do. You can't do them all. At least not at the same time. You can do it all. You can't do it all at the same time. But if you say in advance, okay, what does my week look like? How do I make sure I live out my values of being a mom, being a professional, taking care of my body, hanging out with friends? How do I do that in advance in the right proportions, given the limited resource of time that I have, forcing you to make that trade-off to say, you know what, I really would like to spend 3 hours with my kids, but I only have an hour. That's all I'm willing to give. And that's okay with me because I planned it in advance, given the other constraints.
Yeah. And I'm curious for a moment about our belief systems, because if, let's say, somebody has a belief, right? Like a client of mine that was here earlier, we were doing some work on a core belief that she formed at a very young age, which is that it's my responsibility for other people to be happy, right? Other people's happiness is my responsibility. And so she has gone through her entire life pretty much caring for her children, now grandchildren and husband and so on. And kind of at this point in her life, she's like, it's my time, right? I want now the focus to be on me. So let's say if someone has a belief like that, right? Then one would imagine that there's more internal triggers, right, that might come up in, when it's time for them to say no to something, right, so that they can stay focused on whatever it is that they've intended to stay focused on to get traction. So how do belief systems play into this?
So the problem with, so that's, I'll cut to the chase of what I think about that belief first. Let's see if it's a good belief, right? Is it a rational belief to judge our responsibility based on someone else's happiness? And I would say that's a terrible metric, because happiness is a subjective state, right? It's not objective reality. It's subjective, right? How do I know if you're happy? Well, you have to tell me if you're happy. Now, all of a sudden you're not happy. So that means I have to take responsibility for that. It's an impossible metric. So what I would do is to say, how can we turn your values into time? That is an objective metric. How much time I spend as a father with my daughter, that's an objective metric. I can't be responsible for her happiness. I can be responsible for only objective things. She needs to be fed. She needs to be clothed. She needs to be housed. She needs, her books for school. Those are objective things, and how much time I spend with her. So that, I think, is a much healthier metric, because it forces you, again, to make trade-offs. Now, if that's all you want to do, right, which is enough, being a parent is enough. That's great, but do that fully. What I see much more often is people who want to do everything at the same time, and then they accomplish nothing. They want to be a super professional. They want to be a super parent. They try and do it at the exact same time, and they're terrible at both. So it's not that I'm saying you need to do one or the other. I'm saying be conscious of when you do what, because you can't do it. You can't be on a Zoom call and being fully present with your kids. I see these people who try, it's a disaster. Their kids resent them and they're bad at their jobs. So you need to figure out how you're going to do those things in advance based on time. Time is the most important metric. And so if you can do that, I said earlier, measuring yourself based on that one metric of did I do what I said I was going to do without distraction, that applies to spending time with your kids, right? But when you're not with your kids, you're not with your kids, you're fully there. But when you're with your kids, they know you're 100% with them at that time. Does that kind of answer the question, or did I go off track?
Well, it is very helpful, I think, for many of the people listening who are balancing these different parts of their lives and that feel a duty, right, to support others that they care about. So I'm curious about, so in this example, right, she shifted her beliefs. She realized she released some attachments and she got the learning that she needed, which is that it's not actually her responsibility at that deeper level. So I'm curious, what do the deeper kind of core beliefs, right, have to do with all of this? Because when I often think of what you're describing as to be the internal triggers, right, the feelings that we have, whether it's boredom or whatever it is that we're feeling, that is probably manifestation of something that was even deeper than that, right? There's a reason why there's a certain story that we're telling ourselves in that moment that's making us feel a certain way that then we try to soothe, right? To move away from the discomfort there in that moment, right? By a distraction or something. So I'm just kind of curious because, I've heard a little bit around, you speak around beliefs and so on. And so where do beliefs come into this, if you don't mind sharing your thoughts about that?
Yeah. So one of the techniques involved with mastering the internal trigger is reimagining the trigger. I think one of the shockers for me when I was researching the book, and for a lot of people, is that we don't actually control our emotions. We don't control our emotions. We don't control our urges. Think about it in terms of when you feel the urge to sneeze. Okay, when you feel the urge to sneeze, you don't control that urge. You already had it. Well, the only thing you can control is how you will respond to that emotion, respond to that internal trigger, how you will respond to that urge. Do you sneeze all over everyone and get them sick? No, you take out a handkerchief and you cover your face because that's the responsible thing to do. How you will respond is what matters, not the sensation themselves. So this really comes down to what we call reappraisal, thinking of the internal trigger differently. So whether that internal trigger might be guilt, in the case of your client, or shame or fear or uncertainty or anxiety, it's about how we will respond to that discomfort. So for me, I'm a professional speaker. And one of the things you don't want as a professional speaker is stage fright. And I used to really struggle with stage fright. And so time and time again, I would go up on stage, and right before, invariably, every single time, my heart rate would increase, my armpits would get sweaty, I'd start getting kind of nervous inside, I'd have these butterflies in my stomach, and many of us have felt this. And for me, I started having this internal dialogue that I was not enough, that if I was feeling these internal triggers, that must mean that something's wrong with me, right? That maybe I'm not good at this. I should have had more practice. Who do I think I am? I'm going to mess this up. Even just talking about it right now, I'm feeling the same physiological symptoms as we speak. I still feel them. And then the more research I did into this field, and I uncovered a lot of this research around acceptance and commitment therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. And so much of these treatments, of these methodologies, are about reappraisal, are about reimagining the internal trigger. So still to this very day, I'm constantly doing talks in front of larger audiences. I still feel the exact same internal triggers, right? I still feel my heart rate. I still feel the butterflies. I still have sweaty armpits right before I go on stage. But now I reassess that discomfort. I've reimagined that internal trigger. So now I don't tell myself those awful things I used to say to myself before. Now, whenever I feel that discomfort, I reimagine it. So I tell myself, okay, my heart rate increasing shows me that my brain needs more oxygen. So my heart is pumping more blood to my brain so I can deliver my best possible talk. So that's where it comes to beliefs, right? Beliefs are just stories we tell ourselves. They're just stories, but we can change the story. Just because you feel guilty that you're not spending enough time with your family, or just because you're afraid that your boss might need something, you need to realize that is not objective fact. That is subjective. That is just an opinion. It's a story you made up. I can't tell you how many clients I've worked with who, when I tell them about time boxing, they say, well, I can't do that because I have clients who might need me. My boss might need me. My kids might need me. All these things. And it turns out when you actually look at what is objective fact, it's all fiction. It's all just a story. It's not that your boss and your kids really need you. It's that you're afraid they might need you. The internal trigger is the fear, not the objective reality of what's going on. That's a big realization. It's a story. So we can reimagine those internal triggers. If we can tell ourselves, oh, you know what's going on? When I feel this way physiologically, how is that serving me? So just like I did on stage, we can do that for all the internal triggers of boredom, guilt, fearfulness, anxiety, stress. It's about reimagining those internal triggers.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. The reimagining, in a sense, reframing, as you said, the story allows us to shift the perspective and then be able to perceive a more objective truth, right? And when we do that repeatedly, as you said, when every time you get on stage or whatever, I imagine that the body gets somewhat accustomed to it, and there isn't the same alarm, or it's kind of to be expected. And when we expect it and we have something to do about it, there's more control and there's more empowerment and therefore more comfort. So if it's okay, for the time we have left, would you be willing to share a little bit more? So we've said number one is mastering the internal triggers. Yes, we have got my little cheat sheet here, making time for traction, right? That's the second. And then the third was hacking back external triggers. And then the fourth was preventing distraction with PACT. So would you be willing to share a little bit more about the third and the fourth steps, please?
Sure, absolutely. I do want to say there's one thing that maybe I can toss in there real quick. When you start realizing that it is subjective reality, not objective facts, everything in your being rebel. Everything about that realization will tell you it's not true. It must be objective facts, right? That's nice for Nir to say, but in my life is different. I'm the exception. And people, as you're listening to this, you're going to concoct every possible reason why this won't work for you, because that means you'll have to do the hard work. Right? Getting up on stage for me is hard. It's scary. It's difficult. It requires a lot of practice and patience. And just like putting aside the time for your kids and instead doing that big project, your client, when they say, oh, I feel obliged to constantly be with my kids, many times what's happening is that their brain is telling them, I need to be with my kids. And secretly what's going on, their brain is sabotaging them from doing the hard work they really don't feel like doing. So I want people to be on guard, that will be what your brain instinctively will do. It'll find ways to sabotage you. But really, it's that you don't want to do the hard task. You don't want to do the exercise. You don't want to do the work on your business because you have some other internal triggers that you may need to address. So that's a quick note to be aware of. Now, we talked about making time for traction, hacking back external triggers. You're going to go into that?
No, I just wanted to say thank you, and that I agree with you, and that at a deeper level, one might say, and I believe in all cases, that it's a protective mechanism. Yeah. So if, let's say, that part of us doesn't want us to do the hard work, there's a reason for that, and it's a very loving, protective reason, maybe maladaptive, but at the heart of it, it's a protective mechanism, which is why accepting, and you see some of these other techniques that you mentioned, works really well. And I'm again grateful that you share much of that in your book. So yes, please.
Sure. So, okay. So we could do a podcast episode and more just on every one of these strategies, but for the sake of time. So hacking back the external triggers, there's a little bit about it, about, your phone, your computer, about all these external triggers, the pings, dings, and rings. That's kind of kindergarten stuff. I can teach you in 5 minutes how to make the technology no longer a problem. What's a much more frequent distraction are the external triggers that we don't think about as necessarily distractions. For example, meetings. How many of us have days booked with pointless meetings that didn't need to be called in the first place? So I teach you exactly how do you build an indistractable workplace? How do you permeate these tips, these tactics to make sure that if you're going to have a meeting, that meeting is quality. And so there's exactly how to do that. Email, right? We think, oh, it's corporate email, right? That's important. I got to respond to every email. Turns out that this can be, the average knowledge worker spends over 130 minutes a day just checking email. Well, that can be a huge productivity sink if we know that about 50% of those emails people didn't need to respond to in the first place. So what do you do about that? How do you make sure that you don't have to spend all that time wasted with distracting emails? And then there's, and then of course there's all the pings, dings, and rings that we can deal with that as well. So that's what hacking external triggers is all about. Finally, the last step of becoming indistractable is about making pacts. Now, pacts are what's called a pre-commitment. A pre-commitment is when we decide in advance what we will do when we face a distraction. So some kind of pre-commitment. We have effort packs, we have price packs, and we have identity packs. And so this is the last line of defense. This is what we do after we've mastered the internal triggers, made time for traction, and hack back the external triggers. This is the firewall against distraction. So it's some things as simple as using a technology to block out distracting technologies. There's all kinds of free tools out there that can help us do that. Making pacts with other people, using these various pre-commitments that as the last line of defense becomes the fourth critical strategy to becoming indistractable.
Wow. So thank you for walking us through all of this. And as you said, we could spend much time on each one of these steps. And this is why I'm really grateful that you have all of that in this amazing book. And I know you have many resources online for individuals that get the book. And that's, really incredible as well to give us the details and give us the tools. And so I highly encourage people to check out your books. And how can people learn more about you, your keynote presentations, all the amazing things that you do?
Thank you so much. Yeah, so my website is nirandfar.com, but Nir is spelled like my first name. So that's N-I-R, nirandfar.com. And the book is called Indistractable, How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Nir, and would love to have you back to speak with us about your second book. Or I should say it was before the second book, the book Hooked, because I think this is something that, is really incredible as well. And I invite people to check that out. And I really wish you continued success. I think that what you're sharing with the world is very needed. And at the end of the day, it allows us to get to know ourselves better and to be able to be empowered and make choices that are aligned with what is really most important to us so we can live our best life. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.